Okay, so welcome to the beginner level Blender workshop. This is going to be the first in a series. If you're watching this while the series is still happening, it's planned that we're going to meet every Friday, Friday night, probably about 8 p.m. And not really sure how many they're going to be, but we're going to go through a couple of things, mainly about the game asset pipeline and what it takes to actually um, build assets for 3D games and import it and do certain things with them in engines. So first off, what is Blender? So Blender is a 3D rendering engine. It's primarily used for 3D modeling, which is a section of the game engine pipeline. But you can also use it to render images or scenes or whatnot. Um, and this can be seen in this top right corner. Blender's actually done like a full like short film that they've rendered out and done all the animation for and all the VFX for, all in Blender just to kind of show how powerful it is. So it's not only used for game development stuff, you can use it for cinematic stuff and a lot of other things. And one of the important things about Blender is that it is free and open source. And if anyone out there knows a good bit about like software development and stuff like that, it being open source is a pretty big deal. Um, so here's a couple examples of things that can be made in Blender. Um, I did not make this one on the left. I'm not that good. But I did make this guy on the right. He's more of my art style that I like to do. But this guy on the left is kind of showing the power of Blender and what you can do with it and how it actually can compare to a lot of the more industry standard stuff like ZBrush or Maya and that kind of thing. And it can compare to that while being free and open source. Okay, so let's get started. So this is the point where you should open up Blender. I will have links in the description of where to get Blender. I believe it's just blender.org, or you can get it on Steam for free. So when you open up Blender, I'll open it up in a second. But when you open up Blender, you're gonna see this kind of like window viewport thing. Now it might look a little bit different. I have some preferences set up that I have specifically for my copy of Blender, but it should look about like this. Maybe some of the colors will be different. So this main area highlighted in red is your viewport. Pretty self-explanatory. It's where all of the 3D stuff goes on, where all your objects will be. It's like kind of your main view of the 3D scene. This box over here, this is like the world outliner if you've worked in some engines. It's called the scene collection for Blender, and it's pretty much just a hierarchical list of all the things that are in your 3D scene. And you can see that that'll be useful later for certain things like parenting if we want to parent certain things to other objects, but we'll get into that more later. But for now, it's not too important, other than it just kind of shows you what's in your scene in a very like easy to read list form. Down here, this is all your animation stuff. You'll pretty much never use that unless you're doing like things like character animations or making enemies that can fight or something like that for your game. And over here, this is a really important, just kind of like the general panel for all of the modifications and just a lot of preferences and properties of objects and stuff like that. Like these first 6 tabs from the top are all going to be about rendering your scene and what's the background color of your scene and different rendering options and stuff like that. So we won't usually use those when making game objects because we don't actually care about rendering them out. We just want to export them to get into a game engine. Up here you have your classic, file, edit, all that stuff. And also these tabs. I don't use these tabs super often, but it's pretty much just preset viewport structures. Like if you've ever used like Unity before, you have a bunch of different windows that you can move around and position in your viewport. And these are just like preset ways of doing that for specific workflows. Like if you wanted to do sculpting, you would go to the sculpting viewport. Doesn't mean it's impossible to do it in here, but it just they set it up so it's easier for you. This thing over here, this is like um, just kind of like a toolbar for like I guess just tools that you have when you're editing your objects. I almost never use these because pretty much all of these things map to hotkeys, and I will almost exclusively use the hotkeys. But these I guess are good if you're not comfortable with the hotkeys yet. And there will also be a link to a notes file. It's a markdown file that was written by someone in the club while he was taking notes on the last lecture. And I'll link that in the description because it has a bunch of really cool or really helpful notes on like what hotkeys do what and stuff like that. Up here, we have this object mode is kind of like a tabbed menu mode thing where you can just kind of tab through different modes. We'll go more into that later. And then these are just a couple more options you can mess with. Up here you have a couple, I guess just a couple more options. Um, yeah, I mean they're not, I don't usually use these a lot. This one all the way to the right is the one I use the most, but I'll get into that in maybe today, maybe in a later tutorial, I'm not sure. All right, so with that, let me just hop into Blender. Oh, and this is the markdown file that I'll provide for you guys. So today we're going to be making a nice car asset. And yeah, so this is just going to be a really nice indie asset you can use for any kind of car games. Very simple to make, and it should teach a lot of good practices. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a new Blender file. So you guys should look something like this, and you can see here that I have an add-on that shows you all of the things that I can do or that I'm doing. And it just kind of shows you that in case you're wondering, like, what was the last thing that I did, what keys did I press, and all that. Okay, so let's get into the very basics of moving around. And so the movement keys, you're going to get used to them if you use Blender a lot. But right now, the scroll wheel is zoom. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you hold down your mouse button and move around, that's going to be your rotating. If you shift and hold down your mouse in your middle mouse button, it's going to pan. And those are the three that I use. And it is important to note if you don't have a mouse and if you're using a laptop with a trackpad, um, we're going to go into some preferences that will allow this to be easier for you. Um, but you won't be able to rely on this stuff down here because it's going to be different for you if you have a trackpad. Okay, that said, now I'm going to go into a couple preferences that you're going to want to have. And to get there, you go Edit, Preferences. Now this is going to be a first time setup kind of thing. And it's just going to be like quality of life stuff that is good to have when you're starting out. So let's see. If you go to System, um, you can see this little menu here. If you know a lot about graphics cards and what kind of card you have in your computer and like what your specs are, then just kind of search through here and click on your graphics card, make sure they're highlighted. Um, or if you don't have a graphics card, give integrated graphics, then you can do your CPU. This is only really important for rendering stuff, which we won't use in the game asset pipeline when we're making assets for games, but it's good to have in case you ever do want to render stuff out. Next up, actually, I also prefer to have this undo steps at 64. I'm not sure what it defaults to, but 64 is just good quality of life. Lets you go back a bunch more than 32. Next, I would go to input. I would check emulate numpad. And what this does is it has a good description there. It says the main 1 to 0 keys act as the numpad ones. It's very useful for laptops if you don't actually have a numpad. But even on a keyboard that has a numpad, I just prefer them. It does override the original macros that are bound to the main 1 to 0 keys, but I've literally never used the main ones. So I just the macros on the numpad are much more useful, so I like to have those on the main 1 to 0 keys because they're closer. If you're on a laptop with a trackpad, you're going to click this emulate 3-button mouse. Um, and yeah, it says emulate middle mouse with alt left. So if you ever see me doing middle mouse or something like that, then you just know you have to do alt plus left mouse. But if you have a mouse, you don't have to worry about that. Let's see. In key map, you're going to want to make this select with mouse button here. You're going to want to make that left. I'm going to keep it on right just because that's the way I learned it. Because a while ago when I started using Blender, back in like days of, I don't know, 2.7, we're on 2.8 right now. Um, it was right right button select default, right? So I learned that way. But if you're coming from any other 3D program, it's most likely best to do like to start learning with the left button select. And also, spacebar action, I have it set to search. Again, I'm not sure what it is default, but search is useful. It just lets you search up any kind of tool or command that you might want to use. Okay, and I believe that should be all of the, yeah, that should be all the preferences you should need. Okay, so now that you have all your preferences set up, you only have to do that once every time you load in Blender. From now on, it'll be all set up. Okay, so now we can get started on making our car asset. So let's I'm going to import this car just so that we can see it as we're building it. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of what we're trying to build, but you guys won't have this, it'll just be on my screen. Um, so the first thing that we need to talk about in Blender is all object oriented, where it's like everything is made up of objects, right? So each one of these things is an object that we have, and you can see all of our objects are listed in this scene collection, the world outline, or whatever you want to call it. Um, and you can see we also have two extra objects here. We have this one, which is a camera, and we have this one, which is a light. Now we're going to go ahead and delete these. Now, um, because you don't really want a camera or a light when you're exporting into a game engine, because when you're exporting into a game engine, you want the actual, whatever game engine you're using, you want that to handle all the lighting and all the cameras and all that stuff. All you really care about when making an asset is just the physical object. So we don't want to export this stuff with our car. So you can select these, and keep in mind while the thing down here says that I'm right-clicking to select, that'll be left-click for you guys. Um, so we're gonna go ahead and select one of these objects. Now you can go up here, right-click and hit delete, but the easier way to do it is just hit X. That'll pop a little confirmation menu, and you just click on click on the confirm, and it will delete these objects. Okay, so with these deleted, now we can start building our car. Now, the first step of our car is that we want to kind of get this flat um, base area so that we can then, we're going to get the flat base area, then we're going to work on the, I guess the top part, the windshield and all that. Then we're going to add the details like the headlights, and then we're going to add the wheels, then we're going to add some coloring. Okay, so there's a couple hotkeys that are really useful when you're working with an object. The first one is G. Don't ask me why it's G, but it just translates the object around. If you hit G and just move your mouse around, you can just move your object. Now, um, excuse me. It's also important to note that whenever you're really doing any action, you can always right click and it will just cancel it, right? This applies to moving around, this applies to rotating and scaling and all that. You can always right click and it will just cancel it and put it back to where it is. So that's a very useful feature. Okay,
Maybe it's G for grab and drag around.
maybe, it could be,
I don't
but
know.
not
Might be
sure.
useful mnemonic.
Yeah, I don't know. So you have G to grab and move around. You have S to scale, and this it's important to note this scales it all uniformly. And then you have R to rotate. Now the second that you try to do anything specific, you're gonna kind of run into a problem. Like if I wanted to rotate this 45 degrees, like clockwise, right? If I try to do that, it's like, well, it's rotating it in a very weird way that I don't really want it to rotate at. So there's a couple ways you can do it. The first way you can do it is you can use, like if we wanted to rotate it 45 degrees clockwise on the z-axis, we can just do this. This is actually counterclockwise, but we can go over here. And this is the transform of your object. If you've worked with game engines before, the transform is essentially just the location, the rotation, and the scale of your object. So you can click and drag all of these, and you can set them by clicking on them. Um, you can do pretty much whatever you want with all these, and it will just manipulate your object that way. Um, I tend to not really use this a lot just because it's pretty slow. The faster way to do it is if I wanted to rotate it clockwise on the z-axis, I can hit R, and instead of having this weird rotation, I can hit Z to lock it on the z-axis, right? So you can see that Blender has made this z-axis here, this blue line, that essentially is we're constraining our rotation to this axis. And you can see over here, when we do this, it also reflects that. So I'm going to hit R and Z, and now instead of trying to like line this up at 45, I can just type in 45. Or just on my keyboard, I can just type in 45, and that will lock it to exactly 45 degrees here. Okay, now I'm just going to Control Z that because we didn't actually need to do that, but it's important to note how to lock stuff to axes, right? Now, this also, you can do this for the z-axis, you can do this for the y-axis by hitting Y, or you can do it for the x-axis by hitting X. And it's also important to note that this works with moving around. If I wanted to just move something on the y-axis, I can hit G and then Y, and that will constrain it to the y-axis. You can do the same with the x-axis and with the z-axis. I'm not sure why those inputs aren't showing up down here. Let me go ahead and check that. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is, but it should be pretty easy to figure out if you know that the green axis is the y-axis, the red axis is the x-axis. Okay, so we know we can move and rotate on any axes. Um, Now, what if we wanted to move on, you know, let's do we wanted to move this around but not have it go up, right? So everything but the z-axis. So just moving around on the x and y-axis. Well, I can do x here, I can do y here, I can do z by locking that axis. But if I wanted to do not the z-axis, but both other axes, I can do Shift Z. Now Shift Z will make it where it doesn't move up at all, right? It just moves on the x and y axis. So if you ever want to lock something, um, if you ever want to lock the axis of like everything but the z-axis or everything but the x-axis, you hit Shift and then the axis that you don't want it to move on. So Shift Z means it won't move on the Z-axis. Shift X is like it won't move on the X-axis. It's a little hard to see in this kind of 3D view, but you get the idea. And this is the same thing um, like with rotation. It doesn't work as well, but you get the idea. Now lastly, we have S to scale, right? We can scale uniformly as we know. We can also constrain this to an axis, right? Sx would constrain it to the x-axis, or Sy, or Sz, or S shift Z, right? Everything but the z-axis. Um, and we actually need to do this as our first step of making the car, right? So we want to make this, bottom of like the chassis. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this on the z-axis, just so it's kind of flat. Now it's going to be if you guys don't have this to look at, it's going to be an estimation game, but it's not that difficult. You'll see how you can tweak things later on to make it look how you want to look. So I'm going to make it a little flatter. Now next, I'm going to make it just a little thinner, so scale it on the y-axis like this, and then make it um, longer, scaling it on the x-axis like this. So now we kind of have a chassis look for our car. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to make this upper portion, like the windshield and where you'd sit and all that stuff. So to do this, we have to insert a concept called edit mode. Now, right now, we are in object mode, as you can see up in the top left corner. In object mode, you can go ahead and you can move around your objects or whatever, but you can't really do any more minute edits or anything like that. To do that, we have to get into edit mode. So it's important to note, you can only be in edit mode for one object at a time, right? So if I go to my car and hit object mode to the menu and go down to edit mode, I will be in edit mode, excuse me, I will be in edit mode for this object, but I cannot edit this object here because they're two separate things. Now, the quick way to swap between object edit mode is tab. So if you just hit tab a bunch, you'll see it swaps back and forth. So since I want to edit this car to have more details, I'm going to right click or left click for you guys to select, and then tab into edit mode. Okay, now you can see that we have kind of like a wireframe view a little bit, where we can see our edges more clearly. We can see these dots called vertices, and you can select these. So right now we're in vertices select mode, which means we can select vertices, but we can go up here and change this to edge select, which will allow us to select the whole edge, or we can use face select, which will allow us to select a whole face. And if I don't know if you just saw what I did, what I just did there is I selected this and I accidentally dragged it a little bit before I let my mouse go. Now it's not really too, it's like super noticeable, but you should notice whenever you do this and then just Control Z back out of it because it will end up messing up your designs later on, because you end up wanting to keep everything very symmetrical. So if you accidentally just do that, just make sure to Control Z. Okay, now um, if I wanted to go, so vertices select is the most versatile. If I wanted to select an edge, I can just select the two vertices that make up the edge, right? And then I've selected that whole edge. And it's the same thing as just going to edge select and selecting this edge. And again, selecting the four vertices of a face is the same thing as just selecting the face itself, or doing the four edges of a face is the same thing as just selecting a face. Now, if you hit one of the other hotkeys, if you hit A, that will select everything, right? Now, notice how it's not selecting everything in this object because we're not in edit mode on this object. We're only in edit mode on the car that we're building, not the car we already have. And then another one is Alt A, and that deselects everything. Okay, so how do we get this top looking shape? So what we need to do is we need to go into vertices select mode and introduce another useful hotkey. This one's called the edge loop. Now, if you hit Control and R, you can see it starts to do a couple weird things. Now, whenever I've taught people Blender before, um, getting a handle on this kind of interaction is always a little weird. Um, Usually, it just takes some practice. But what this is going to do is if we're hovering over the right spot, you can see that we have some yellow lines highlighted. It's just going to add edges there so that we can, make edits to the mesh. It's essentially just adding resolution to the mesh, right? Now, what we want to do is we want to add an edge like here and here so that we can pull this top part up, right? We want to add one here and here and pull the top part up. So instead of like taking this cross section here, clicking to add the edge, and then it'll let us drag it around to kind of position it. So if we position it like here and then do it again, and it's important to note it'll always default to like the middle. So if if this is the edge here, it'll default to the middle of this edge, right? That's why it didn't show up in the center again, because we've cut the edge in half a little bit. Okay, so I don't know, about here. Now, this is fine. It's all right. But the main problem we have now is like, if you look closely, here's the center of the y-axis, right? The center is where this little red thing is. But it's too far forward. It's not symmetrical, right? Like these edges are way farther away from the y-axis than these edges. So it's like maybe that's what you want, but in this case, it's not what we want. We want it to be symmetrical. Um, and we might change it later, but for now, we want it to be symmetrical. So I'm going to Control Z, undo some of these until we're back at our normal block, and hit Control R again. Now we're back at where we started, but now if we scroll wheel, you can see we can add how many cuts we want to do, right? And you can go as far as you want and do a bunch of these, but we're just going to do two. And as you can probably see, it automatically evenly spaces them. So we're going to do two, and instead of moving it around at all, we're just going to right click, which will return it to the default spots. Okay, so now we've kind of divided our block into three sections, and I'm going to go into face select mode, take this face, and do something that you'll do a lot. And we're going to go ahead and extrude. Now, to extrude a face, you hit E. Now, Blender has automatically made this z-axis for us because if any of you out there have taken Calc 3 or are familiar with vectors and stuff like that, it takes the surface that we're extruding, calculates the normal vector of the surface, and locks the extrusion to that axis. Now, this isn't always what you want, but if you just like kind of hit like Z twice or X twice or something like that, then it will get rid of it. But we actually, in this case, do want that because we want it to go straight up. So I'm going to extrude and click to about there. Um, these cars aren't going to look the exact same, but whatever. Let's see. Now, you can see in this car, this top here is like smaller than this one, right? Like it kind of slopes inward. So to do that, all we have to do is just hit S, scale this down a little bit, and now you can see we're sloped inward on both sides. We're sloped inward here as well, and that kind of gives us a more general car shape. Okay, now at this point, I'm feeling that my car is a little bit too long. Um, yeah, I think it's a little bit too long. So I'm going to go ahead and tab back into object mode so that we have the whole object selected. And go ahead, scale this on the x-axis and just scale it down a little bit. And then go back into edit mode. Now I could have done this by hitting A in edit mode, just to select everything and scaling the whole thing like that. But either way works really. Okay, so now we're gonna want to add this little windshield, and over here you can see that this windshield is inset, right? It's kind of set into the face. So how would we go about doing that? I think this is one of our last hotkeys that we'll look at, but if you select the face and you hit I, this stands for inset. Now you can see that it just kind of insets this face, adds a new one um, inside the old one, right? So I'm going to get my top and my bottom to about, like I'm going to get oh crap. I'm going to get these to about the width that I want, even if it's going to look weird. Like it's going to look weird because these are too thick, right? But I'm going to get these two at the width that I want, and then I'm just going to take this face and scale it on the Y to just make these a little bit thinner. So now you can see we're not inset yet. Like we haven't pushed it back inside to the windshield, but we have this little shape that we're going to use. So now all we have to do is hit E to extrude this face, and we can inset this. I don't know, about there works. Yeah, that looks nice. Okay, okay. So now that we've inset this face, we can move on to adding some of the details. Now, adding details is a little more complex in terms of the structure of how your world is built. Um, we're going to start to add things um, inside of another object. So if I go over here to this car real quick, just to show you guys something, you can see that like this little handle here, I didn't extrude or inset the face, right? It doesn't have these edges here that show that it's been inset or anything like that. This is just something like something else, right? And you can see this is actually just something that I have set to clip through on the y-axis, right? It's just another block clipping through the car because this is low poly. We don't need a ton of detail. So to do that, um, we're going to introduce probably the last, or one of the last hotkeys, which is Shift A. Sorry, Shift A. There we go. Now this is your add menu here, and you can see it lets you add a bunch of stuff. You'll pretty much never use any of this stuff except for the meshes. The meshes are the most important things. So we didn't have to do this at the beginning because we had started out with a cube. But if we wanted to add a cube, we just hit Shift A, go to Mesh, go to Cube, right? And you can see it's spawned a cube in the middle here. So if I just go ahead and move this car out of the way, we have a new cube, right? But the important thing here is that, if I wanted this cube to be a handle, right? Um, You guys don't have to do this, but like if I wanted to, make just a little handle here, right? You don't have to follow me on this because we're going to undo it in a second. But with this car, right, the handle follows it around when I move the car. If I do this, the handle doesn't follow it around because they're two separate objects, right? Here we have a cube that's our car, and this cube 0.001, which is this extra cube here. So I'm just going to undo what I did there. Go back till we have our car. Now what we want to do in this case is we want to add another cube to be our handle, but we're going to add it while we're in edit mode. And if we add it while we're in edit mode, it'll parent the cube we add to this object, right? So if we hit Shift A in edit mode, you can see we have significantly less choices than before. It's as if we already hit, like if we'd already gone into the mesh here in object mode. If we're in edit mode, it only lets us add meshes. So let's add a cube here. Um, Obviously, this is way too big, and I'm going to move it over here on the Y, just to get it out of the way. Scale it way down. And here, I'm going to introduce a concept of viewport shifting. Now, if you went into your preferences like we did before and hit emulate numpad, what that does is now I can hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on my numpad, but actually on my main like 1 through 0 keys, and it locks us to a view, right? So in this case, we're locked to like the left view. That's 1. So 1 is the left view, 3 is the front view, 7 is the top view, and then 2, 4, and 6 just increment you along those axes. I don't really use those as much. I tend to just use 1, 3, and 7. And I'm also just going to hide this for you guys. Okay. So I'm going to go to 1. So now we can see, we have a good view of our handle, and so we can position it well. This is the front of our car, right? Here's our windshield. So I'm going to scale my handle down the Z-axis to make it thinner and position it to, I don't know, there, kind of where I want it to be. Now it's important to note, it's not actually there, right? Because when we hit 1, we're just looking at it from this direction, so we can't tell depth. So let's go to like 7 for the top view now, and hit G and then Y to constrain to the Y-axis, so we can start moving it into our car. And I'm just going to make it a little bit thinner by scaling on the Y. And now it's kind of clipping through our car, and we have a nice little handle. Okay. And we'll add color to them later so that you can differentiate them. And next we're going to go ahead, what else? We're going to go ahead, we can do a mirror. Yeah, we'll do a mirror. Oops, sorry. Okay. We'll add a mirror. So again, we're going to go into edit mode and add a cube. Move it over, scale it way down. I'm going to go on to 7 for the top view. For this, I'm just hitting Z, or hitting G. So if I'm in the top view, then I hit G without constraining any axes, it will automatically constrain the Z-axis, which is depth for us, right? So I can't move this up and down in the world. I can just move it side to side right now. So I'm going to kind of position it to where I'd want it to be. Go to 1, move it up on the Z-axis. And if this is fast for anyone, feel free to just pause it. And then, let's see. I'm going to want to make it kind of a, let's see, I'm going to obviously want to make this thinner, so I'm going to scale it on the x-axis to make kind of a thin mirror. And then I'm going to scale it on the y-axis to make it a little bit bigger this way. And then move it up some more. And I'm going to go move it on the x a little bit this way, just so it's feasible that someone could look at this and it's not too close to the side. Now this is obviously just floating, so I'm going to Control R to add an edge loop here. I'm going to add one in the middle here. I'm actually going to move this one over a little bit to about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to face select, select this bottom face here, and extrude that downward. So now it looks like it's connected to the car. Now what we can do is, let's say we wanted to move this bottom face, but now it's in the car. So how would we go in and find that? Well, you can like clip through the car, but this isn't the best way to do it. It's kind of unreliable. So if we hit Z, sorry, oh yeah, Z. Um, Z opens up the viewport menu. You guys will be on solid, or sorry, the shading menu. You guys will be on solid view just because it's the default. But I changed mine to material preview so that we can see the colors on the other car. If you want to use material preview as your default, that's fine. But for now, we're going to use wireframe. This does exactly what you think. It makes everything wireframe. So now we can actually see this face that's down here and select it. And I want to kind of slant this a little bit, so I'm just going to move this on the y-axis. So, I don't know, I think it looks kind of better. And then we're going to hit Z again and go back to our default, which can be either of these. And now it looks kind of slanted. And now, because I slanted it, I kind of wanted to move it over a little bit more, like this way a little more. So, an interesting hotkey you can use is L. So L will select all of the linked objects, right? All the things that are actually connected by edges. So yes, even though these two things are clipping through one another, it only selects these things, like the part of this object, or sorry, not object, but the part of this mesh, because these are all linked together by vertices. So it doesn't matter that these are touching at all. It just matters what's actually physically linked together. So I'm going to hit L to select the whole thing, and then G to move, and Y just move it over a little bit. Okay, that looks good to me. So I'm going to Alt-A to deselect that. And what we're going to do is we're going to build all of the stuff for one side, and then copy it over to the other side at the end. And I'll explain how to do that at the end. So next, I'm going to build a headlight. This is going to be pretty easy. I'm just going to Shift A, add a cube, um, move this on the Y, scale it way down, and then I'm going to hit 7 to kind of position it where I want. Um, it's obviously a very large headlight. Let's move it out a little bit, scale it down some more. I'm going to make it thinner by scaling it on the X. 3 goes into front view, so that's nice to use for this. I'm going to make this a little bit wider on the Y-axis and just kind of position it where I want it to be. It's good enough. Okay, that's a very simple headlight. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make a tail light. So what we can do for this actually is we can just hit L, select this whole object, and we can use Shift D. Now Shift D duplicates the exact same, like all the stuff you have selected. It duplicates all that. Now I'm going to hit Shift D and then right click, and it looks like I've canceled it. I have actually not canceled it. I have not moved it around at all, but there's still two objects here, right? So I'm going to then hit G and X to move this until it pops at the back, and then hit G and X until I get it about where I want. Now, if the taillights, I actually think I want them to wrap around a little bit, so I'm going to move it on the Y here, and I'm going to take this face here. If you go into wireframe, you can see it better. This back face here, and just move this on the X so that it wraps around a little more. Okay, and we'll add color to those later as well. Let's see, what is next? Front and back bumper, and then the license plate, or the grill, or whatever you want. Okay, so let's do the front bumper first. This one will again be pretty easy. I'm going to add a cube. I'm just going to scale it down the z-axis, scale it down on the x-axis, and then just move it forward on the x-axis. I'm going to move it down. It's too thick, so I'm going to make it less on the Y. It's a little too thick this way, so I'm going to make it less on the X and move it in. I think it's a little too tall as well, so I'm just going to scale down the Z. Yeah, that looks about right. Okay, L to select this whole object, and we're just going to throw it in the back here as well. So Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to hit X to lock this on the X-axis, and then just kind of slide it back here, and then click. Okay, so now we have our front and back bumper, and the license plate. I'm just going to literally copy the bumper here, Shift D, move it up a little bit, scale it on the Y-axis, scale it on the Z-axis a little bit. There you go. Now it's important to note for things like this, the license plate or the bumpers or stuff like that, you want these to be centered on your car, right? So as long as you've been building your car at essentially at y equals 0, so centered on the y-axis, you can see, for this license plate, our y location is 0, right? And that's how we want it to be. Now, let's go ahead and copy all of this stuff over. So we're going to want to take, if we hit L, you can also use L to multiple select. I just hit L a bunch of times on the stuff I want to copy over. Right, so we obviously don't want to copy the license plate of the bumpers. So now that we've copied this over, or now that we've selected all this stuff, I'm going to copy it with Shift D, but we're going to run into a problem, right? If I hit Shift D, constrained to the Y-axis, it's like, all right, but the mirror is the wrong direction, and also, how do we make sure that that all the stuff is in the same position, right? Like that this um, light is in the same position as this light's going to be over here, right? How do we make sure that's the same? So I'm going to right click here so that, remember, the objects are still there. We've still duplicated them, right? We can still move them around, but they just look like the same thing because of the exact same spot. Now, I'm going to introduce you to another tool that I'm not sure that I covered in our in-person lecture. So if you're watching this, you get another tool. If I hit period, it brings up a bunch of things about how we're going to edit stuff and how we're going to move stuff around, right? It's called the pivot point. Now, you can also go up here, and this is the same menu, just in a different form, right? So, but it's period is the hotkey. So right now, the pivot point of all these objects is going to be the median point of the volume of all these objects, right? So it's going to go ahead and calculate the volume of all these objects and say, okay, if I were to rotate this stuff, it would all rotate around the physical center of volume. Um, if you do physics stuff, it's going to be like the center of gravity. It's going to rotate around there. But if I hit period, I can change it, right? So I actually have never used this one or this one. The important ones here is individual origins and 3D cursor. So let's go ahead and try individual origins. And if we go ahead and rotate it, you can immediately see the differences. It rotates it around the center of mass for each of the individual objects, right? And this is the same thing. You can scale it like that, right? Because if we were back on median point and scaled it, it would scale it from the center of mass. But if we go to individual origins and scale it scales it from each individual origin. Now, this isn't really going to help us, but it's good to show. The one that will help us is 3D cursor. So, the 3D cursor, as a lot of you might have experienced by accidentally moving it around, is this red and white thing in the middle. So if I left click or if you guys right click somewhere, right, it'll move this around. Now this is just an arbitrary point in 3D space that can go wherever you want. It's a tool really. It doesn't actually affect anything in the project, but you can use it as a tool to do some really useful things. So if you've clicked on it and it went somewhere that's not the center, we want it in the center for this operation. And what we want to do is you can hit Shift S. Shift S brings up this snap menu where we can say, okay, let's snap the cursor to the world origin, right? The world origin at 0, 0, 0. So that just brings it back. We can also do things like snap cursor to selected, so it'll snap it to the center of this face, or it'll snap it to the center of like this whole object, or whatever. But for now, what we want to do is we want cursor to world origin. And the reason for this is if we go back and select all of this stuff that we want to flip over, we can now do a really cool trick. Let's scale all this stuff on the y-axis, making sure that we are on the 3 cursor kind of pivot point here. We scale it all on the y-axis. You can see, we can kind of flip it around the y-axis like this. And this is really cool, really helpful, because all we have to do is enter -1, and it will just flip the stuff on the y-axis for us. Hit enter to save it all in, and now we have all the same stuff on the y-axis. Now, it's important to note that you'll forget to do this, but um, you probably want to switch back to medium point. Maybe not if you're going to do more copying stuff or whatever, but usually you want to switch back to medium point because you're going to end up trying to do something and it's not going to work how you think it's going to work, and then you're going to be frustrated and have to look up the issue or whatever when you should just switch back to medium point. Okay, now we have all of our stuff copied over. Now we have to work on the wheels. So, for the wheels, if I go back to my car over here, you can see the wheels are interesting because we haven't, right, if I look at here, we've cut out like a section for the wheels. And obviously we haven't done that on this car. So we have to do that, and we have to add the wheels. And then we'll add color and be done. So I'm gonna hide this again. The first thing we're gonna work on is cutting out the section. Now I'm gonna switch into solid view just because it's easier to see things. But to cut out the section, what we want to do is we want to go back into object mode so that we're editing individual objects. And this is another thing that the last live lecture didn't get. We're gonna actually use a modifier this time, and we're gonna add a cylinder for mesh cylinder. Now, when you add an object, this menu down here pops up, right? And we can expand this menu, and we can edit some things about the object, right? Obviously, they're pretty self-explanatory and whatnot. But the annoying thing is that that menu only pops up when we add the object, right? Let me just reset these. If I were to select something else and then go back, that menu's gone. That's pretty annoying. I wish Blender would not do that, but there's interesting reasons for it we can get into later on in a different tutorial. It is the right thing to do, but it's just kind of annoying. So if you ever want to re-access the menu, you're best off just deleting your object and making a new one. And I'm going to make this have 12 vertices, nice even number. And that way we get that nice blocky kind of look that we want for a car, because if it's too high, then it's going to cut out like a perfect sphere. And I just think that's not what we want for the style. So I'm going to make that 12. Okay, so I'm going to rotate this on the X by 90 degrees by hitting RX, then typing 90. And then obviously I'm going to scale it down. And I'm going to move it out on the Y-axis. Let me go to 7 for the top view. Scale it up a little bit. Move it over here to where I want the tire to be. So what this is going to do in the end is it's going to cut out a tire, like cut out that tire slot, right? So I kind of want to position it to be, wherever these objects intersect is where it's going to cut out. So wherever it's clipping through is where it's going to cut out. So that's about where I want it. I might move it out just a little bit. If it doesn't make sense right now, it'll make sense in a second. So I'm going to go into I'm going to select this car object. Now, all of these tabs over here, you really only ever use 2, at least until you get into some more advanced stuff, right? Here's the modifiers, and you can see we can add a bunch of modifiers, and this is the materials tab. We'll get into materials later. It's how you add color and all that stuff. So for the modifiers, we're going to go ahead and add a modifier called the Boolean modifier. And the Boolean, it's Halloween, forgot about that. What this does is it lets us take a cylinder here and it intersects with like the intersection with the cylinder, you can see is going to be cut out. So you can see if we select our object here, we've now cut out this little portion. It's hard to see right now because obviously there's the cylinder in the way. But if you go to this modifier, hit this little drop down and hit apply, then you can see if we move this out of the way, we've actually cut out a section. So I'm just going to use this same thing again and go over here. Sorry, go like this. Now it's going to be important how we do this because we want the tire spots to be in the same spot on both sides. All right. So the best way to do this is to Control Z until we've, undone this, so it's not cut out yet. We haven't applied the modifier. Duplicate this, move this to wherever you want that tire to be. That's about right. I might make that shorter in a little bit. Okay, that's fine for now. And now it's important to note that we've made another object here, and this Boolean modifier acts on objects. So right now, we only have one modifier for this one object, so let's add another one, selecting our other cylinder, cylinder 0.001, which is this one. You can see it just cut out that little section there. So now what we want to do is we want to use the same kind of trick as before. We want to reflect this over the y-axis. So I'm going to go ahead and set my cursor to the 3D, or set my pivot point to 3D cursor. Select both of these by Shift select, and then Shift D to duplicate. Right? Instead of moving around, I want to scale it. So I hit S, and I constrain it to the Y, and then -1 to flip it on the y-axis. And then I'll enter. Now, again, I have to then go and add more modifiers for each of the ones that we just added, right, for each of these cylinders. And you can see it cut out these tire shapes. Okay, so now we can go ahead, now that we're sure they're all symmetrical, right, because we flip it on the y-axis, so we know it's all in the same spots, we can go ahead and apply all these. So just go through and apply them all. And we can go ahead and delete these because they've served their purpose. Okay, so we've cut out this tire, or this tire hole, I guess. Now we gotta make the tire. So I'm going to go into edit mode so that we make sure that the tires are all parented to the car, right? Because when we add an object in object mode, it's not parented to anything. When we add an object in edit mode, it'll be parented to the thing that we're in edit mode on. So it'll be parented to the car. Let me take a drink real quick. Okay. So I'm going to add a cylinder. 12 is fine. Like, it's going to save what we had before, so 12 vertices is fine. It's going to be a kind of blocky wheel, but whatever. Style. RX90 to make it horizontal. I'm going to go hit 1 so I can go to this view, scale it down, and since it's now inside the car, I'm going to go hit Z and then wireframe so I can see it more clearly, and then just kind of move it to position it. It's obviously too big right now. Oh, and see, if I try to scale it now, we're still on 3D cursor mode, right? We're still pivoting at the 3D cursor. So it's going to scale it toward the 3D cursor. So I'm just going to change that back to median point. Scale this down, move it up on the Z. It's about where I want it for here, but obviously it's not in the right spot. So I'm going to move it on the Y. I'm also going to scale it on the Y to make it thinner. Go to 3 for front view, just to make sure it's not like intersecting with anything. I'm just going to make it a little bit thicker and then move it out a little bit. Yeah, it looks fine. Okay, now I'm going to go to hit 1 to go to this view, Shift D to copy it, move it on the x-axis to over there, and then just hit L on this object to select it as well. Go back to my 3D cursor pivot point because I want to flip it on this axis. Shift D, S, Y, -1, enter, flips it on this axis, and now we have all four of our tires where we want them to be. Um, yeah, so actually going to Control Z all that and add some more detail to the tire and do that again, just because I want to add some, I don't know, just make the tire look a little nicer. So I'm going to take this face and set it, and see, in this case, it doesn't really work how we want it to. The inset doesn't always work perfectly. It's gonna have some weird things because the math is it's trying to do a bunch of math. So I'm gonna Control Z that, and instead I'm going to extrude. Oh, actually, before I do that, I need to change this back to median point. I'm gonna extrude and then scale, and this is kind of the more uniform inset that we wanted. So I don't know, go to there. I'm gonna extrude this into the tire, and then I'm gonna extrude and scale again, and then actually I'm going to select these and extrude these out. Yeah, that's just kind of a more detailed tire. And then we're gonna hit L, go to side view again with 1, Shift D, move it on the x-axis to there, L to select this one as well, go back to our 3D cursor, pivot point, Shift D, scale on the Y, -1, click to enter, and you can see that these have scaled over onto the other side, or are flipped onto the other side. Now, because we only edited the one side of this tire, you can see these back sides are still plain, but whatever. You're not really gonna ever see that. Okay, so now let's compare. I'm gonna go back into material preview so you can see the color on this car. So the tires are a little bit different, but for the most part, like this is our finished car model. And because of how we made everything, you can see if I just move it around, everything moves with it. Because of that, we added all of our extra stuff in edit mode. We added all the stuff that we wanted to be part of the car in edit mode while we were on the car. So now all we have to do is color this car. And coloring it is pretty easy. I'm going to go back into edit mode, go to the materials tab, and you can see that we already have a default material. You might not have this. Yeah, I have a couple materials in here already because I imported this car, but it might look like just empty for you. Like it might look like just this. So if this is the case, I'm going to add a material slot. Now, if anyone's ever programmed before in a language that's not Python pretty much, you know you have to instantiate a variable and then set the variable. I mean, you don't always have to, but you can do it that way. So for Blender, you have to instantiate this material slot, you know, declare that it exists, and then you can add a material to it. So this is going to be named material or material 2 or whatever. It's only material 2 because I have a couple materials in here already. So what you want to do is you want to rename this to something that has a good naming convention. My standard naming conventions are M for material underscore and then, I don't know, car base, like the base material of the car. So just M underscore to let you know it's a material because when you export materials into game engines, it's really helpful to be able to search for just M underscore and have that select all your materials. That's more of a preference thing. You don't have to do it that way. You can name it just car or whatever. Now, there's a couple things, there's obviously a lot of options here, and we're going to get more into some of these options in the intermediate to advanced level tutorials that are going to be next week. But for now, we're just going to change this base color to whatever you want, really. I'm gonna get this color exactly by with the iDriver. So we have that pretty close to that color. And then I'm also going to change a couple things. because I want like a toon shading for this car, like if I'm gonna make a low poly game that's like got a toon shading kind of aspect, I want there to be no reflections. Like I don't want the car to be shiny at all. So I'm gonna turn up the roughness to 1, and then turn the specular, which is almost like, which is just like shiny aspect. Um, roughness or specular and metallic are kind of the same thing, but there's slight differences that we'll talk about later in a different tutorial. But I just want the roughness to be up at 1, um, and that makes it where pretty much no light is reflected off of this car. Now, obviously, we want certain things like our headlights and our taillights and our bumpers and tires to be different colors. So how do we do that? Well, we need to add another material. I'm going to name this one metal. And I'm just going to use this for anything that should be metal, like the tail or the bumpers, um, like the mirrors, the handles, some of the tire maybe. And I'm going to make this like just like a gray. But obviously, nothing's happening to our car. And why is that? Well, by default, our car is going to use the the first one you made. I mean, so we made the first material, the car base first, and we can make this metal material. I'm also going to do the same thing. I'm going to make the roughness 1 and the specular 0. Um, but now we have to tell it where to put this material, right? So what we can do is we can go into edit mode on our car, and let's go ahead and select all the stuff we want to be metal. So like here, by hitting L, here, 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 here. That's all the stuff I want to be metal. Um, and then I'm also going to take here. So I'm just going to use this on the this part, and we can change that in a minute. It'll be easier to do it later. So once we have all the stuff selected that we want to be metal, I'm going to click on metal and hit assign. Now this assigns all the stuff we have selected to be metal. And there's a reason I only did this one tire instead of all the rest, and you'll see that in a minute. So let's make another material, call it tire, make this a darker color, and I'm actually, instead of selecting everything, I'm going to select everything and then shift select to deselect the metal ones. Assign that to black for the tire. And then I'm going to make another material, windshield. This is going to be like a lighter metal. Go into edit mode, windshield, assign. I'm also going to assign that to the license plate. Doesn't make sense for the name, but I mean, it ends up looking fine. And I'm also just going to make that a little brighter. There we go. I mean, obviously, M windshield probably shouldn't go on the license plate, but who cares? It looks fine. And then let's go ahead and do M headlights. Make those a nice yellow. Select the headlights. Assign. That's a little too yellow. Make it darker and a little bit less. There we go. And then I want the taillights to be red, so new material, taillights. Make this red. And I'm going to go through and make sure that I did taking specular down and roughness up for our toon shading-ish look for all these materials. Okay. So now we have the colors that we want. We just gotta make the tires a different color. And because I'm lazy, I'm just gonna go ahead and just delete these tires and copy this one over. Control D, X. There we go. And I can see that we're already on 3D cursor here. So I'm just gonna Control D or Shift D, S, Y, -1 to flip them over there. And that just copies the materials over. because I didn't feel like going through and selecting all the other tires or whatever. I just copied these. Okay, there we go. That's our car. And you can see you can add a lot more detail here. Um, you can do certain things like next tutorial we're going to go into the different types of materials you can use. Oh, I didn't actually make taillights for this one. Anyway, so there's like emission materials you can use that would look better for the lights that actually emit light and stuff like that. And we can make this drive around and whatnot. But for now, I believe that's all that we will do. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. And lastly, you're going to save. Save as just car.blend, save under file. Um, Now you don't have to save. My preferred way of doing it is just making game objects and then exporting them. So I'm going to go ahead and file, export. Now the reason that that we removed the camera and the light at the beginning is because we didn't want to export them with our object. But we can go file, export. There's a bunch of options here. The one I use is FBX. Um, I don't actually know why. It's just the one I've always used. But there also is OBJ, it's a very popular one. I'm going to go ahead and hit FBX. Here we have some options. This will export everything in the scene, but we can say just selected objects, but you don't need to do that right now. We can export on like different dimensions, like change where forward is and where up is and stuff like that. This is some animation stuff down here, and you can just choose where you want to export. Just export to my desktop, and there you go. Now we've exported. Now I'm going to go ahead, just to show you that we actually have exported, I'm going to delete this, hit File, Import, FBX, and Desktop, Car. And there you go, it's imported again. And the last thing I just remembered that we should do is currently, if I were to move this up, you can see this little dot here, right? This little blue dot in the middle. Now the blue dot in the middle is the pivot point for the object. So if I were to rotate, or sorry, if I were to move this back to individual origins or median point, it's the point where this is all going to pivot around. Now, a lot of times when you're in a game engine, um, if I were to drag something out onto the floor of a level that I've created, it will snap the pivot point to the floor just to make it easier for you to set up levels. So if that was the case, right, if I were to make a makeshift floor here, and I would snap the pivot point to the floor, you guys don't have to do this, but it would look like that. Obviously, it wouldn't be good. And if you have any physics that are based off your pivot point you can call it the pivot point or the object origin. If you have any physics that are based off of that, um, this would look like it's driving in the ground. So obviously not the best. What we want to do is we want to have it, driving on the ground. So to do that, we want to change our pivot point to be down on the ground, where the ground should be. So the best way to do this is we want to make sure that it's still in the middle of the car, but just moved down. So I'm going to go ahead to edge select mode, select the bottom edges of these tires. Now, don't worry if you have a bunch of these, like if a bunch of your stuff is blue, um, like a bunch of your edges are blue, that just means that it's been exported and a couple things have been applied to it when it was exported. So ideally we'd do this before it was exported. So, um, but it doesn't mean you can't work on it later. So we select our edges down here. Just hold on. Yeah, we have those selected. And then we're going to want to hit Shift S to move our 3D cursor to select. So what this does is this snaps our cursor, this 3D cursor, to the middle point of the selected stuff. So we have these edges selected, these 4 edges. So I knew to select those edges because the middle would be at the ground point, and it would also be in the center of the car. So now we have our 3D cursor there, but our origin's still here. If we go back into object mode, we can go ahead and hit Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. Now you can see our origins here. Now if we were to rotate this, it rotates around that point, right? But now, because we've changed our origin, if I go to this transform thing on this tab, or if I hit N to transform, N is just kind of like a quick menu for this stuff. You can see that we're no longer sitting this car at 0, 0 because we've moved the origin, right? It was at 0, 0, but we moved it. So we're just going to go ahead and set this back up to 0, 0, 0, and it's slightly tilted, so it's fine. It's probably just round off error. And there we go. Now we have the origin where I want it. And I'm going to go ahead and export this again. And I'm going to overwrite the car we just exported because I want this to be, like this is the correct and updated version, so I want to overwrite that, whatnot. And I'll save this blend as well. There you go. That's our car. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. That was a very introductory version of this tutorial. I will be going into some more depth next week and hopefully have that stuff updated for you guys. So yeah, hopefully you guys can make it to the live meeting, but if this is, if the archives tend to be successful, then maybe you're watching this in the future, who knows. But until next time, I will see you guys.